Hey everyone, guess what?
What?
Paradise After Dark will be featured in the month of November in the True Crime Calendar.
There's a true crime calendar?
Yes, you can order it on podcastcalendars.com and use our promo code Paradise for 10% off. There's also a pre-sale going on from now until November 30th for an additional 10% off.
That is awesome. You know what? That would make an awesome Christmas gift.
I know, right? Christmas is coming. So everyone, podcastcalendars.com and use code Paradise.
Hi, everyone.
Hello.
I am Lauren.
I am Ken.
And this is Paradise After Dark.
Dark.
Paradise After Dark is an independent podcast covering true crime,
Unsolved mysteries,
missing people,
urban legends, and every now and then a creepy place.
Please check out our website, paradiseafterdark.com. On the website, you'll find links to all of our episodes, even the archived episodes, our mailing list, merch store, link to our social medias, and of course our Patreon.
Yes, and at our website, we also have a virtual tip jar, so if you swing on by there and leave us a tip, we'll give you a shout on the show.
And in case you haven't heard, for the month of October, we are donating all of our Patreon earnings and our tips from our virtual tip jar to the Florida Relief Fund. In case you've been living under a rock, Southwest Florida was hit by Hurricane Ian, and there's a lot of people in our area that are really hurting. So we're doing the best we can. We're collecting money in our tip jar on our website to donate to the Relief Fund and help those people out, because this is our community, believe it or not.
Yes, it is a really good cause, and Lauren, we've actually already gotten some support.
Yes, we have.
A couple of supporters were OGs.
Yes, but what do we got, Ken? You've got the list, I think.
According to our list here, a couple of the original OGs, people that we met actually in New Orleans, we have Dana and Shelly.
Dana and Shelly.
Yeah, they were like the long crew. They hung out with us until the end when we were packing them and going.
Thank you, guys.
Yes, thank you very much. Also, one of our number one fans, Amy.
We
got Amy in there.
Amy is always there,
Yep.
there for us every month.
And I think we have a new patron who actually donated as well.
Yes, Sandy. She donated to our tip jar and she signed up for Patreon. So
That's
thank
awesome.
you, Sandy. Welcome to our Patreon.
And thank you, everyone. Thanks for everybody that's thinking of contributing, and obviously the ones that have already put forth some funds. We're going to make sure that goes to the right people and the right cause.
Yes, thank you so much. So, Ken, do you want to just slide on into our latest episode?
Well, I thought you were going to say slide in my DMs. I'm like, hey, girl, you can call me anytime. Call me. No, yeah, I think we should. This is another one of those old unsolved cases that there's so much talk about, and there's some conspiracy, there's some connections. So you want to kind of start us off and tell us what we're talking about?
Well, the murder of the Bricca family in Cincinnati, Ohio on September 25th, 1966 is one of Cincinnati's most notorious cold cases. On Sunday, September 5th, 1966, Gerald, aka Jerry Bricca, a 28-year-old chemical engineer, was last seen taking out the trash at his family home on Greenway Avenue in the Cincinnati suburb of Bridgetown between 8:30 and 9 p.m. Jerry was scheduled to go to the airport the following morning to catch a flight to West Virginia with a coworker for a business trip. Jerry did not make that flight on Monday morning. The coworker called Jerry over and over that morning to no avail. Later on that Monday, a neighbor grabbed the Bricca's newspaper that was in the driveway and tossed it on the front porch. This was when some newspapers were delivered twice a day. You know, you had the morning edition and then the evening edition.
Yep.
And this particular newspaper that the neighbor tossed on the front porch was the evening newspaper. So we need to note that here because the Monday morning newspaper was not outside.
So that kind of gives us placement, time placement.
This neighbor noticed that the Bricca's outside floodlights had been on the night before and all day that day and into the following night, which was very unusual.
Neighbors notice those kind of things.
Yes.
Well, 2 days later, neighbors noticed that the papers had been piling up at the home and thought it seemed suspicious. Now, Linda would usually be outside with Debbie and the two family dogs, Thumper, a Cocker Spaniel, and Dusty, which was a poodle. But the house was eerily quiet that Tuesday, and the trash cans that Jerry had rolled out Sunday night still stood at the end of the driveway. Now, Dick Meyer, who was a concerned neighbor, tried calling Jerry at work, and Meyer learned that Jerry hadn't even showed up at work in 2 days. This was very unlike Mr. Bricca. Jerry was always at work. Matter of fact, I think he worked like 80 hours a week.
They called him a bit of a workaholic,
yeah,
actually.
I think they said that he was working like 80 hours a week.
Yeah.
He was pulling double time. So at the insistence of his wife, Dick Meyer, and another neighbor, Dick Jansen, went to the Bricca home to make sure that they were okay. Now, after opening the unlocked front door, Meyer, who was a World War II veteran, recognized the smell of death. I guess he had said that it was just radiating. He knew exactly what it was as soon as it hit his nose. So he immediately shut the door and called the police. And the detectives were notified and responded to the house where they found Jerry, his 23-year-old wife, Linda, and the couple's 4-year-old daughter, who we mentioned earlier, Debbie, dead in the home. Now, officers asked Meyer to go in order to identify the dead family. Other than that, the scene was completely secure. Now, this is unlike some cases back then that we covered where the whole town traipsed through the crime scene and walked all over everything. Although there were a few sources that I found that said that they had like 3 or 4 different police departments that traipsed through the crime scene. And they had some reporters in there and people, photographers, but that was kind of just what was witnessed there. I don't think that actually occurred because I think they were bringing in law enforcement from other counties because it was something new to this area. They never had seen anything like this.
Right. Well, the investigators decided that the killer knew the family. No forced entry, no defensive wounds, no sign of a struggle. 2 very aggressive dogs were neutralized. J.T. Townsend, an author who wrote about the murders, told Fox 19 Now in May of 2022. Meyer was briefly questioned, but it was clear that neither he nor Jansen was the killer. According to the True Crime Garage podcast coverage of this case, the coroner, Dr. Frank Cleveland, reported the following findings. All 3 family members had been stabbed to death. Both adults had penetrative head wounds caused by an unknown object. Jerry was found face down in his bedroom. He had been stabbed a total of 8 times, 4 to the back, 3 to the neck, and the wound to the head, which was likely a stab wound. He was fully clothed, and his shirt was covered in blood. He had a pair of dark-colored dress socks stuffed in his mouth. Investigators believe someone had stuffed the socks in and then applied tape over his mouth, as he still had a small piece of tape hanging off of the side of his mouth. Linda was found face up, but there are conflicting reports about her position. Some say she was meticulously placed on top of her husband, and some say she was only slightly on top of him. According to FBI statistics, posing only happens in approximately 1% of murders, so this in itself was a peculiar signature, if that was the case.
Well, one thing that came to mind when I was looking into it was, is it possible that maybe she sort of was trying to shield him? Like maybe the damage was done and she was like trying to protect him?
Maybe.
I mean, that was kind of my thought, but then the posing made sense, but then obviously where maybe she had fallen on top of him. I don't know, but it seemed to me like it's possible that maybe she was like trying to protect him. I mean, it was her husband.
Right. So she had been stabbed a total of 9 times, 6 times in the chest, 2 in the neck, and the wound to the head. Her nightgown was torn at the breast. There was evidence to suggest that both Jerry and Linda had been bound at some point in time, but the material used, possibly tape, was removed from their bodies and was not located. Debbie, who was found on the floor in her bedroom, had also been killed with a knife. Debbie was stabbed 4 times, each thrust piercing completely through her small body. One investigator observed it was overkill. The assumption, based on the stomach contents and Jerry's co-workers' unanswered calls, is that they died on Sunday night. The possible posing of the body as well as the stabbings led many to believe that this was personal, a crime of passion.
Well, the murder weapon was never found, which appeared to be a carving knife taken from a kitchen set. Now, according to the Cincinnati Enquirer, the knife was from an Indian carving set fashioned from teakwood and steel, and it was missing from the home. And because Debbie was only 4 years old and of a bit of an inquisitive nature, for her safety, the carving set was never left out in the open. It may have been kept in one of the drawers found standing open when the police arrived. Now, this likely continued to lead investigators on the, quote, someone they knew path. I always have to ponder these forms of murder where it appears the killer or killers arrive without the murder weapon. I mean, obviously they show up without a weapon at all.
But there's other things that we're going to get into here in a few minutes that indicate that the killer did come prepared.
Okay.
So let's keep going forward with this. The direction of the stab wounds indicated that the killer was left-handed. Now, this sounds very familiar to the Sims family murders, which took place in Tallahassee, Florida, less than a month after the Briccas were killed. In the Sims case, the father, Robert Sims, the mother, Helen Sims, and 12-year-old daughter, Joy Sims, were murdered in their home. The parents were shot, but Joy, the 12-year-old, was shot, stabbed, and sexually assaulted. Investigators suspected, based on the stab wounds, that Joy was murdered by a left-handed person. There's been a lot of speculation over the years that these two cases are connected. According to HistoryByDay.com, and as we noted earlier, the Monday morning paper was missing, so detectives theorized the killer stayed in the Bricca home at least until dawn, possibly even wrapping the knife and evidence in the newspaper and throwing it out in the garbage can. By mid-morning, it would be on its way to the municipal dump.
Well, fingerprints that were unknown, as they did not match the family, were found in areas of the home that any regular visitor would not have likely touched. The problem was they couldn't be matched to anyone else either. Now, it remains unclear if the fingerprints were even from the killer, since police didn't disclose that information publicly. Also, keep in mind that this is the 60s, and there's no such thing as APHIS. Now, the idea of having to manually match prints could take hundreds of hours. Additionally, hairs were found in Linda's hands. This sounds like enough evidence for our new area of genealogy crime fighting, but remember again, this takes place in the 60s. As for DNA, evidence for this case wasn't stored well enough to allow modern testing to take place. Now, the dogs, one of whom was prone to biting anyone who tried to get close to Linda, was locked in a room on the lowest level of the tri-level home, possibly by Jerry before answering the door, but it's unclear. There was speculation that the dogs may have been drugged by the killer or killers to keep them from barking. And when the dogs were found, they were fine. They were just hungry.
But despite an extensive investigation, over 400 interviews were conducted with anyone remotely connected to the Bricca family, spearheaded by the Hamilton County Sheriff's Office. No suspect has ever been named. No murderer has ever been brought to justice. We still don't know who killed the Briccas or why. We do know that the Briccas were very unlikely to be victims of the Cincinnati Strangler, who was killing women in Cincinnati, Ohio between December 1965 and December 1966. The Strangler was eventually caught. His name was Posteel Lasky Jr., and his victims were all women between the ages of 31 and 81, living in Cincinnati's various housing complexes, which were inhabited by poor residents of the city. The Briccas lived in an upper-middle-class suburb called Bridgetown. Also, the hair and fingerprints found at the Bricca crime scene did not match Lasky.
And according to True Crime Garage's podcast, the Briccas were one of the youngest families in the neighborhood, to the point where the neighbors actually nicknamed them the Kids. Bridgetown was considered to be so safe that the police department only had staff on hand for 14 hours per day in this neighborhood.
Wow. Let's take a quick break.
It's mostly quiet on Muriel Court, but that wasn't the case in 1966 when Robert Sims, his wife Helen, and young daughter Joy found gagged, stabbed, and shot to death.
Safer politically to leave it alone.
It is there now. Take care of the problem.
Who killed the Sims family in Tallahassee, Florida on October 22nd, 1966? Check out the new podcast, Massacre on Muriel Court, an in-depth, serialized podcast about this cold case. Subscribe now on whatever platform you get your podcasts.
Moronic is the word that comes to mind.
He's accusing two top officials of a cover-up.
Standing back there under the banana tree.
Okay, now we're back. Jerry, originally from California, was a graduate of Stanford University, and as mentioned above, he was a chemical engineer and worked for a company called Monsanto. Monsanto was an American agrochemical and agricultural biotechnology corporation. Jerry had actually moved his family from Seattle to Cincinnati when Monsanto transferred him there.
If you guys don't know who Monsanto is, just think of Agent Orange.
It's been said he loved his job, and some say a little too much. He often worked weekends, just like he had that Sunday, the last time anyone saw the Bricca family alive. He's been described as a workaholic.
As we mentioned earlier, for the 80 hours a week. Now, little Debbie Bricca was the darling in the neighborhood. All the neighbors adored her, and it was said that she was mature for her age, able to hold whole conversations with adults, which is odd for a child so young. Now, as mentioned, she spent a lot of time outside playing and walking the neighborhood with her mom, Linda, and her two dogs.
Linda Bricca was also a very well-liked lady by all who knew her. She was not only very intelligent, but she was also quite beautiful. Linda was originally from Connecticut. Before meeting and marrying Jerry, she was an airline stewardess. She graduated high school at age 16 and started working for United Airlines when she was just 18. Now, back in those days, being an airline stewardess was a glamorous profession. You had to be beautiful and smart to land a job in that field. She actually met Jerry on one of her flights. Linda also loved animals and worked part-time at a veterinarian's office, the Glenway Animal Hospital. The bodies of the Bricca family were sent to Chicago, and they were laid to rest in Barrington, Illinois.
Well, let's gather some more information about the Bricca family crime scene here. There was no sign of forced entry into the home. The front and back doors were both unlocked when the family was discovered. So either the doors were unlocked and the killer or killers just entered the home, or they knocked on the door and were allowed in by one of the family members, which brings us back to the idea that the perpetrators were known to the victims. Now, the TV in the living room was on, because most likely they had sat down that stormy night to watch the largest national broadcast at the time, which was the original ABC airing of the bridge over the River Kwai, along with 60 million other viewers who had tuned in that night. Now, at this point, it was said that everyone was set down and in their homes that evening. It was a rainy night. Everyone sat down to watch this, 60 million viewers, which was huge in the 60s. Now, there was a half-folded basket of clothes, as if someone was in the middle of folding them and was interrupted, which, if the knock on the door, makes sense. Now, there were a few drawers open, and Jerry's wallet was found open on the bed in the master bedroom, but there was no money inside. However, the initial investigators noted that it felt staged. Do you understand what I'm saying there, Lauren?
Yeah.
It felt staged. It is theorized that Linda's torn pajamas were also staged to encourage fake headlines and confuse investigators. Kind of what you mentioned earlier about positioning the bodies. It seemed staged to investigators at this point. It's also highly unlikely that if this was a robbery gone wrong, that the perpetrators would stay and torture the family before they killed them. There was no sign of a struggle in the house, which should be noted as odd because stabbings are usually pretty brutal and messy. Now, there were also no defense wounds on anyone in the family, meaning it wasn't likely that they even fought back unless they were already tied up when they were stabbed, as Lauren mentioned earlier, about possible some duct tape residue or something that was removed.
Pathologists were certain that Linda Bricca had sexual intercourse before her death, but it's unclear whether it was consensual or not. And of course, there was no DNA testing to prove who she may have been with. Because Jerry worked so much, there was some gossip about Linda Bricca possibly having an affair. Now, Bridgetown was a close community. People looked out for each other, and everyone seemed to know everyone. What I'm trying to say is that neighbors saw things that maybe they didn't register until after the murders were discovered. According to author Glenn Wall, in his book titled Zodiac Maniac, on Saturday, approximately 24 hours before the murders, Hamilton County Sheriff's Deputy Ray Hoffbauer, who had just finished his shift and was returning to his Greenway Avenue home, the same street the Briccas lived on, stopped at his mailbox and noticed a man in a beige jacket standing in the dark about 25 feet away and seemed to be watching the Bricca home. Deputy Hoffbauer asked the man what he was doing, and the man replied that he was waiting for a friend. Now later, Deputy Hoffbauer recalled the man was tall and slim and appeared to be in his early 20s. Less than 2 hours later, another neighbor noticed a man who appeared to be in his 20s, wearing dark pants and a beige jacket. This time the man was pacing back and forth under a street light while moving his hands as if he were gesturing to someone or talking to himself. More than one person in the area noticed a bright red sports car parked near the scene at about 5:30 a.m. The car stuck out like a sore thumb. They didn't have many bright red fancy cars in that area. And lastly, Joan Jansen, wife of Dick Jansen, one of the men who found the Briccas, stated that around 4 a.m. that Monday morning, their dogs went nuts, barking and growling as if someone were outside or possibly cutting through their yard. And obviously, it's always been a main theory that the killer or killers knew the Bricca family.
Well, one man in particular stood out. His name was Fred Leininger. And he not only lived in the same neighborhood, he was a veterinarian that Linda worked for and the man she was rumored to be having an affair with. Apparently, Linda wanted to break it off with Leininger shortly before the murders. The police spoke to him in September of 1966 while they were gathering background on the Briccas, and then ended up interviewing him again for 45 minutes on October 8th of that same exact year. Now, he was apparently deceitful about his relationship with Linda, but several people came forward to say that they had seen him with Linda walking on back roads or parked in lovers' lanes. During the interrogation, he became really distressed when the investigators contacted his wife. Detectives did speak to Leininger's wife, and she informed them that her husband did not appreciate them speaking to her. She provided no valuable information about her husband or the murders. That's when Leininger called the lawyer and invoked his right to remain silent and refused to cooperate with police any further, and they were never even able to ever get his fingerprints.
According to WCPO Cincinnati, 6 weeks after the killing, Lieutenant Herbert Vogel, who headed the Hamilton County Police investigation, cleared the Bricca's next-door neighbor, Dick Meyer. When he did, the prosecutor at the time, Melvin Ruger, said that narrowed the list of suspects to one. Ruger didn't name him. The circumstances pointed to Leininger. He said the suspect was hiding behind his attorney, that he had given a 10-minute interview about his knowledge of the Bricca family and a 40-minute taped interview to Vogel, but he refused to give any samples or speak further. But those who knew Dr. Leininger claimed there was no way he could have murdered anyone in such a brutal fashion, especially a child. He was never cleared as a suspect, but after the initial interview with him, investigators never went after him any further. He retired in 1995 and moved to Florida. On February 23rd of 2004, Leininger and his wife Lynn checked into a hotel in Cincinnati. They both injected themselves with a lethal dose of heroin and put plastic bags over their head.
Whoa.
Fred Leininger died on that day, but Lynn survived. Lynn Leininger lay in a hospital in a coma until she eventually passed away on December 4th of 2004.
While much of the evidence does give the impression that this was a crime of passion, if you look at this from a different angle, it kind of looks like a thought-out and planned crime, locking up and possibly drugging or sedating the dogs, tying up the victims, sticking around to clean up the crime scene, removing all the bindings before leaving. This leads to the idea of planning, as it appears the murderer knew what they were doing enough to remove evidence from the crime scene.
Another theory is that Jerry or Linda knew too much that made them a liability. Now, as we mentioned, Jerry worked for the Monsanto Company, a popular biotechnology and chemical company. He was in charge of planning for the Monsanto's Addison, Ohio installation. What we know now that no one knew back then is that for nearly 40 years, the Monsanto Company hid the fact that while producing the now banned industrial coolants known as PCBs at a factory in Anniston, Alabama, Monsanto Company routinely discharged toxic waste into the West Anniston Creek and dumped millions of pounds of PCBs into oozing open pit landfills, according to an article in the Washington Post written by Michael Grunwald on January 1st of 2002. According to this article, thousands of pages of the Monsanto documents, many emblazoned with warnings such as confidential, read and destroy, show that for decades the corporate giant concealed what it did and what it knew. In the fall of 1966, Monsanto hired a Mississippi State University biologist named Denzel Ferguson to conduct some studies around its Anniston plant. Ferguson, who died in 1998, arrived with tanks full of bluegill fish, which he caged in cloth containers and submerged in various points along the nearby creeks. This is what he reported to Monsanto about the results in Snow Creek. All 25 fish lost equilibrium and turned on their sides in 10 seconds, and all were dead in 3.5 minutes. As for the Addison installation that Jerry worked at, later on it was revealed that Addison had elevated levels of PCB pollution, so they were likely doing the exact same thing that they were doing down in Alabama.
So like I mentioned earlier, Monsanto's and the Agent Orange. So you think about the chemistry and the chemicals and what they were doing. I mean, they were doing some pretty shady stuff that could hurt the environment, drinking water, because it was
they were poisoning water.
Exactly. The water supply to a lot of these little communities, I mean, that's where they get their stuff from, or the water from, I should say, rather. So is it possible that Jerry may have known what was happening and been labeled a possible whistleblower who was going to expose the Monsanto company? So was someone hired to get rid of him? If you think about it, it makes sense.
Right.
Why not kill this guy? Because if he blows the whistle, it could potentially bring down an entire corporation. And guys don't like to lose billions of dollars, especially in the 60s. But then, why kill 4-year-old Debbie? Murdering Linda is unfortunately understandable if you subscribe to this theory, because Jerry could have told her everything, but not the child. Maybe if you had been around Debbie as a coworker of Jerry's and may have thought that she could have possibly been able to identify you. I mean, remember, she was a very bright child for her age.
Yeah, that's the only reason I could think of in this scenario that they would kill the child.
Yeah, if you stick to that theory, it's possible it was a hit, so to speak. So let's take a quick break and then we'll come back and finish up.
There are other connections, or you can call them coincidences if you prefer. Now, as mentioned earlier, the murder of the Sims family in Tallahassee, Florida, Dr. Robert Sims, Helen Sims, and 12-year-old Joy Sims, they were murdered in a very similar manner, including the theory that the killer was left-handed. This crime took place 5 weeks after the Bricca murders. Again, there was no evidence of forced entry to the home. Robbery did not appear to be a motive, and there were valuables within plain sight and nothing was taken. The difference was that the Sims were tied up with items from inside the home, hosiery, etc., and the bindings were left behind. Robert and Helen Sims were both shot, and only Joy was stabbed. There were no gunshots at the Bricca scene. But Lieutenant Herbert Vogel was so interested in the possible connection that he reached out to the Tallahassee authorities to try and find any connection. Now, no real connection could be found between those two cases, but many still believe to this day that the cases are connected. Now, we did a 3-part series on the Sims murders back in 2019 that are available in the archived episodes section of our website, Paradise After Dark. And coming up at the end of this month, I am releasing a new podcast called Massacre on Muriel Court, which is a serialized podcast all about the Sims murder.
It's a deep dive.
It is a deep dive, so if you want to check that out, it's already up on all the podcast platforms. You can go ahead and subscribe. It's called Massacre on Muriel Court.
And I think you do some comparisons to the Bricca family.
I do talk a lot about the Bricca family, and I go even deeper in that podcast than we're going here.
Well, sticking to this case, there was one neighbor who told authorities that a couple months before the murders, Linda Bricca seemed scared of something. Linda even told little Debbie's babysitter not to let Debbie play outside. Turned out that 2 women that Linda used to work and live with when she worked for the U.S. Airways, Lisa Wick and Lonnie Trumbull, were brutally bludgeoned as they slept in their Queen Anne Hill, Seattle basement apartment on June 23, 1966. Now, a third roommate, Joyce Bowe, came home later that morning at approximately 9:30 a.m. As Bowe entered the apartment, she noticed that the front door was unlocked, which was unusual, and a lamp was still on in the living room. And when the police arrived, it was determined that both women had been repeatedly and viciously clubbed with a blunt object, though neither had been sexually assaulted. Lisa Wick survived the attack, but had no memory of what happened or who the perpetrator was. The only connection found between these 2 attacks was the fact that the women knew each other years earlier.
Well, 21-year-old Valerie Percy, an attractive, friendly Cornell University graduate, was bludgeoned to death as she lay asleep in the bed of her Kenilworth, Illinois home one night on September 18, 1966. She was the daughter of Bell and Howell executive Charles Percy, who was running as a Republican for the U.S. Senate. She had worked hard that summer on her father's campaign. Her killer bolted after stabbing her 14 times. Nothing from the Sheridan Road home was stolen. So how does this connect to the Bricca case? Well, Linda Bricca and Valerie Percy went to high school together when they both lived in Bridgetown, Illinois, a wealthy suburb outside of Chicago. Lieutenant Vogel was intrigued enough that he went to Chicago to talk to investigators working on the Percy case. But again, they didn't make a connection.
But just as an added bonus here, FBI records obtained by the ABC7 I-Team in 2014 revealed that the prime suspect in the Percy murder was William Thornton III, the son of Kenilworth industrial tycoon who was described in one of the FBI reports as violent, a mental case, armed and dangerous. Now, Percy's home was just a block and a half from the house where Thornton grew up and frequently returned for family visits in the mid-60s. Now, if you can think of a person who is just mad at everyone and mad at the world and lashing out constantly, he was perfect for that. So a lot of instances going back to these teen years was just crazy, said Glenn Wall. This was a Percy murder researcher.
I actually interviewed Glenn Wall in my new podcast, Massacre on Muriel Court. Do you love my shameless plugs here?
I do love them.
So Thorson had actually been a suspect in several murders. Thorson grew up near Linda Bricca and Valerie Percy. According to author Glenn Wall, Thorson lived in San Francisco from roughly 1965 to mid-1969. He also had a home in Fresno during that time. Now, can anyone tell me what was going on in and around San Francisco, California during that time frame? If you guessed the Zodiac murders, you would be correct. You can go ahead and dig into that and let us know what you find out. In the meantime, the murder of the Bricca family is still unsolved.
Well, one thing I thought that Townsend mentioned in some of his reports is, they say like the first 48 hours is the most important.
Yes.
Well, because the first 48 hours had lapsed from the time that the Briccas were said to have been murdered
Right.
till they were discovered.
Yeah.
That they lost that first 48, which sometimes is the most important amount of time possible.
I know.
And that's one thing that Townsend brought up that during the research, I never even considered until I read his article on it. And I'm like, I never even thought about that. I mean, there's a lot of things that can transpire in that 48 hours, not just the contamination of the crime scene because nothing is happening, the decay of the body in 48 hours, but also the slip of the suspects. So, the perpetrator is gone, moved. He may have come back at some points. Oh my God, I forgot this and come back. So, it's possible that he left and said, oh man, you know what? Let me go back and get the duct tape, the bindings or whatever it was that they used to secure him. He could have returned to the scene and then left again. So those are some interesting points that he made. And Townsend wrote a book, I believe.
Yes. Yeah. I'm sorry. I don't know the name of it.
You can look it up. His name's J.T. Townsend.
J.T. Townsend.
Yeah. He goes into a deep dive and I think he is a Cincinnati resident that really does like this deep dive into this Bricca case. So I think that's going to be it for everything tonight, Lauren. I just think that this case is it's sad because they were such a beautiful young couple. And
beautiful family.
There was some thoughts of, some infidelity there. But of course, he's working 80 hours a week. I mean, that could have been a story and it could have been fact. It's hard to tell, but it's just sad because here you have this beautiful young family that was just taken from this earth just way too soon. Never had a chance to grow, especially young Debbie, who's 4 years old. There's no reason in this world that I can think anyone should kill a 4-year-old.
Nobody should kill anybody. But
I understand that. But I'm saying, regardless of what is transpiring, whether it was a hit, whether it was, somebody that was upset because, an affair was happening or whatever the case may be, there's no reason whatsoever to kill a 4-year-old. So it's just a very sad case.
All right. Again, if you'd like to support the show, please subscribe to our Patreon at patreon.com/Palmahawk Media. That's PALMAHAWK Media.
And be sure to check out our website for all of our links to our social media and our merch store and much, much more.
Make sure to subscribe to the show on whatever platform you're listening and rate and review. This really helps us branch out and reach a wider audience.
And as always, thank you everyone for listening
to Paradise After Dark.
Dark, 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 dark.